Hello, it's Alex Goodall here from Your Digital Ally. This video is part of a series of videos that I'm going to be creating about my marketing tool of choice, which is Kartra. It's also going to be part of a series about setting up systems and processes for digital marketing. So it's going to be part of two playlists, in fact. If you've not yet watched the video called Kartra Needs Taming, you might want to do that after watching this video, because it actually gives more justification for the sort of approach that I'm going to be talking about here. So this video is mainly going to be of interest to people who use Kartra or are thinking of using it, but in fact the same ideas would be relevant to the use of any sophisticated marketing tool. Now, the action that I'm going to focus on in this video is adding a new list to Kartra. Now, you may ask, what's the big deal about adding a new list? After all, it's very standard practice in any marketing system, and you would normally simply click a button to create the list, give it a name, and that would be that. But of course, you never create a list without some sort of context, and most likely you're going to need an opt-in form to get people onto the list, which needs to be associated with a thank you page. And you're probably going to want to send them a sequence of emails as a follow-up. And to help you keep track of things, you'll very likely want to create a number of tags, certainly if you're using any of the more advanced marketing systems. But beyond that, there's likely to be all sorts of logic that needs to be applied to make everything work smoothly. For example, you might want to take some special action in relation to unsubscriptions and many other things. Now, in Kartra, you can implement very sophisticated logical rules using something called automations. So overall, you're hardly ever going to just create a list on its own. You're going to want to create all these things simultaneously. Now, I'm not trying to include everything here that you would need for a complete marketing funnel, just the main components that would need to be created within a marketing system. But it's not just a case of making sure everything gets created. The issue with complex tools such as Kartra, and Kartra isn't an exception to this, is that there are many multiple ways to achieve any particular outcome. For example, when someone signs up on a form, exactly what it is that you're going to do to get them added to a list, to get them to subscribe to the list. Within any tool, there are multiple ways you can do this. For example, in Kartra, are you going to do it as part of the form configuration, or within an automation that's integrated onto the form, or by setting a tag in the form, and that tag triggers an independent automation that adds people to the list? Another aspect, how are you going to subscribe people to the follow-up sequence? Again, there are many ways to do this. For example, do you subscribe them to that sequence via an automation which is associated with the form? Or do you subscribe them to a sequence via an independent automation that's triggered when someone completes the form? Or do you insert a trigger within the sequence itself? And then, is that trigger the completion of the form? Or is it the fact that a lead is being added to the list? Or the setting of a tag? And if it's a setting of a tag, where does that tag get set? Is the tag set within the form configuration, or via an automation associated with the form, or via an independent automation that itself somehow gets triggered? So the point is, there's so much flexibility within Kartra. It's really very, very easy to lose track of how you set things up. And I've just given you one example of a particular activity that you would be performing. So, in my view, it's essential to decide as early as you can exactly how you're going to achieve each particular outcome. Create standards for yourself so that you do it the same way every time, unless there's a good reason, obviously, to deviate from the standard. But the default will be always to follow the standard. So, that corollary of that is that you need some way of documenting and describing what your standard practices are. And the good thing is, if you do this in the right way, you can use that documentation as a way to automatically force the compliance with your standards. And I'll show you exactly how I've done that for myself. Now here I'm showing you my Kartra management spreadsheet, and what I'm going to go through with you is a real life example of me planning the setup of exactly the process I've just been talking about, and in relation to a specific new list. And this is a list which I hope you're going to be subscribing to so that you can stay informed about how I'm managing my Kartra account. So this is real life development for myself. So the tab you're looking at now, if you look at the bottom, it says Proc Add New Lists. So this is my process for adding a new list to Kartra. And as I've indicated, it's more than just adding a list, but that's like the essence of it. And it's a tab within, as I said, the more comprehensive document, which is my Kartra management database. In those other tabs, what I do is I actually keep track of every object that I create within Kartra. I started doing this when I was using ActiveCampaign. And when I moved over to Kartra, I modified the setup, but basically kept the same approach because I found it so valuable. Now, although I found it very helpful to have a record of every object I created, that didn't really help me in recording how I wanted to put those objects together to achieve a particular outcome. Again, specifically what it didn't do was didn't document my specific approaches to how I use the tool, either in ActiveCampaign or when I moved over to Kartra, which is why fairly recently I created this tab, which I'm showing you here, the Proc Add New List, which specifically addresses that issue. So this, in conjunction with being able to track all the objects that I create, this helps me specifically document exactly how I'm using Kartra, and also helps me automate the creation of the names and linking them all together. The other thing to mention is that I do have a very strict naming convention for how I name the objects, and that has been very helpful in keeping track of it, because I could create hundreds, possibly thousands. And without proper naming conventions, you're just going to get completely lost. It's going to be a complete nightmare. So very early on, so that you don't have to go back and change everything, it's really good to get those naming conventions nailed down. But once you have strict naming conventions, then you can do the sort of thing I'm doing here. Without those naming conventions, you can't do what I'm showing here. It's only because I know the exact structure of the name of every object I'm going to create. It's only because I have that worked out that I'm able to create a form like this. And you'll get a sense. I'm not going to go through my whole naming conventions here, but you'll get a sense of how I go about it. So, conventions I use for this type of spreadsheet document is that the grey cells just stay grey. The white cells is where I enter values, and the yellow cells are cells that are calculated based on the values in the white cell. Now, in this case, the calculations are just putting strings together, and the purple cells are just like constants, so that a value that's used in this particular case, a category of a tag. It doesn't need to be calculated, it is just admin. So the only things I need to do to make this thing work is put values in for those up in these cells, and that will then give me the names. So you see down here, objects to be created. This tells me exactly which tags I want to create, and it's going to give me the names of those tags, the form I need to create, the name of the form, and the configuration, any new sequences and any configurations of those sequences. The new list, there's nothing else to configure for the list, it's just a list. Tracking links, I'm going to create a tracking link, and that's the configuration of the tracking link. And I'm going to create 1, 2, 3, 4 automations. Again, I won't go through the whole thing in detail, but I'll just give you a sense of how I've set it up. And over here on the right, I've put date created. So, I mean, it doesn't have to be a date, and it's not essential, but because it's so easy to do, I just give a space that I can say, have I done this? Tick yes, or done, or put a date in, or some indication that I've actually created that. So, for example, if I'm halfway through creating these objects and I get disturbed and I go and I come back, I've got a record of exactly where I've got to. As you get older, you tend to forget things more easily, so I just like to keep track of things as I do them. The other element of this is I've got here a record of how I've used this in the past. So, in fact, I've used it once for creating my newsletter sign-up mechanism. And this actually is what I'm going to do now. So I've pre-thought up the names that I want to use. So in fact, what I actually need to do now is take those, copy and paste them into here. And I'm actually done. I've now got a complete record, or instructions as well, of everything I need to create in Kartra with the right names for them and the key configurations. That's it. Very simple. So in a sense, that's the process. I mean, it takes some effort to first of all decide on the particular process you want, how you're going to go about setting everything up. Once you've done that, some effort to create the spreadsheet. But once you've done that, then future activities are really straightforward. Before I had this, I was always going backwards and forward and suddenly realizing, I actually need this tag, I forgot that. I need to create this link. I've got to go back and change that. Now it's really very straightforward. This is going to take me 10 minutes to create all these objects. Yeah, 10, maybe 15 minutes. But that's about it. It'll take me a bit longer to record them in these tabs as well. But it's a lot simpler and a lot more consistent. I would do it the same every time. And if I want to modify my process, I can just change it here. So if that's all you were interested in, that's fine. If you want to understand a little bit about how, what my process is, how I've decided to go about doing the adding, so exactly how I add someone to the list after they've completed the form, or how I actually subscribe them to the sequence and what all my tags mean, then bear with me for another 10 minutes and I'll go through that. So I'll start with what all these things mean up here. First of all, brand. I've set up my naming convention so that I can easily separate out different strands of my business, and I use Kartra a little bit for my personal management of leads for some elements of my life, and potentially for clients. So each of those different strands, each of those different sort of domains, I give a brand name to, or a short form. This is all to do with Your Digital Ally. So the brand code is YDA. I have obviously a set of codes that I've stored somewhere for the brand name. In fact, I could make this a drop down so that I could select those. I probably will do that for those things. I could use certainly some of these could be drop downs. In fact, most of these could be drop downs, and I would just select the appropriate value from the drop down. That would be an advancement of this. So YDA is the brand for this. The topic that I'm talking about, so I define a topic name and then use that in the creation of the names of the objects related to that topic. So this topic name is My Kartra Sys, so I'm talking about my Kartra system. So that would now be standard for anything to do with this. I can have a qualifier for my form name. In this case, I don't want to use one. I'll give you an example of how I did use it. Your Digital Ally, I had a form. I created a form which I only used in blog posts. So the form qualifier, which forms part of the name, was in post, just to tell me that. But I don't need a form qualifier for this. The thank you page, so the URL for the thank you page, doesn't exist yet, but I've decided what the name is going to be, what the slug is going to be. So the thank you page is going to be there. I want a qualifier for the list, and this is going to be a list of people who opted in, so the list qualifier is going to be opt-ins. I like to keep track of where each lead came from. So a lead might sign up to my list, and in fact it might come to my list via one of my business activities and also be added later on via a different business activity. I like to keep track of the original source, where they first were added into my Kartra database. So for each possible way they can be added, I give a reference for the source. And this source is YDA my Kartra assist. It's basically something, they got added in relation to this topic, basically is what that means. Finally, I give, as part of the naming convention for my sequences, I give a sequence type. So this is going to be a follow-up sequence, and it's going to be the first follow-up sequence. If I had a funnel with 3 or 4 products, there could be a follow-up first, follow-up second, follow-up other for different types of follow-up sequence. Again, that's just to help with my naming conventions. So all I need to do is come up with 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different names, and I can now automatically create the names of all the objects that I'm going to be using. And down here it tells me exactly which objects I'm going to be using. I'm going to be creating 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 tags. I'm going to be creating 1 form, creating 1 sequence, I'm creating 1 list. I'm going to create a tracking link. I'm going to create 1, 2, 3, 4 automations. So let's go through the tags. There's going to be a tag which is an event tag. So this says this lead, an event has happened, and this lead has opted in to my Kartra assist. That actually gets set in the form there. So when I can configure the form, that tag gets set. By the way, my general approach, because as I was indicating, there's many different ways in which you can go about doing things in Kartra. My approach, and I guess partly I inherited it from Active Campaign, which wasn't as comprehensive as Kartra. So in a sense, I was forced more to use this approach. It's basically to use tags as much as possible. So I've carried that over into the way I use Kartra, and I think it's useful, because if you use tags, then the tag is like a record of what has happened. So what I could do within the form, I could have said, here's the form. Within the form, I could have, part of the form configuration could be add to a list, but I don't do that. You'll see how I do that in a minute. So within the form, the only thing the form does is it sets this tag, opted in, and you've got to obviously have a thank you page associated with the form. That's it for the form. Other tags I create are, there's a status tag, has access. There's another event tag which is to do with unsubscribe. So if they click a special tracking link within the email, so every sequence I create a special tracking link so that if people want to unsubscribe just from that sequence, they can do that without clicking the main unsubscribe button, which will unsubscribe them, which will then take them to a page, and they can see everywhere they're subscribed to, and they can unsubscribe from various things, and there might be a tendency just to simply unsubscribe from everything. But I give people an option, say, well, if what I'm sending you here in this sequence isn't interesting, don't unsubscribe from everything. Just click this button and I won't send you any more information relating to this topic. So again, I have some logic, some mechanisms around that, and that's what this clicked unsubscribed tracking tag is about. I have a tag here which is to trigger the sequence. So it's a sort of start tag, if you like. It's saying start this sequence, and in fact the way I use it is to use that as a trigger tag in the sequence. And I mentioned earlier that I like to keep track of where the sources come from. So if someone got added to my system for the first time by subscribing to this list, and they're not already on the system, obviously I've got a way of tracking if they're already on the system, or if they've got such a tag, then they'll be assigned this tag, and it's an admin tag, and it's a source type tag, and there's the YDA my Kartra sys, which is this lead source ref, so the reference goes there. The form, as I said, doesn't do anything. It could do lots of things. Kartra allows you to do lots of things. I could have associated an automation with this form, but I don't. I keep it really simple. The only thing it does is it sets a tag. Everything else happens as a result of that tag being set. Create a sequence. Obviously, you've got to put a lot of emails in the sequence, but as far as the initial setup, it does two things. First of all, that's the name of the sequence, and then within the sequence, you can decide what gets that sequence to be triggered, and it's this trigger tag, the start tag. So that's the only configuration I do initially. I create the sequence, put that tag in as a trigger, and that's it. Later on, obviously, I'll go and put all the emails in. I'm going to create a list. That's the name of the list. There's nothing else associated with that. The unsubscribe tracking link, which is going to go in all the emails. That's the name of it. That's the category. The destination page. I have a standard destination page for all these special unsubscribes. It's a Kartra page. And Kartra is so good. There's so much you can do. When people click on the tracking link, it can do all sorts of things. I mean, there's quite a lot more configuration I could do, but the only other thing I do is I set a tag saying here's an event. They've clicked the unsubscribe tag, and that's that. Then I got my 4 automations. The first automation is a new source automation. So this is saying basically, so automations are if-then. If someone's opted in, so the event tag has been set, meaning they've opted into the form, and they don't already have a source within my system, so this tag not set, this tag isn't set, then I set this source tag to say this is the source for this lead, and I set the tag to say this lead has already had a source set. That's it, done. So that little automation manages my source tracking, lead source tracking. Add to list. So this is finally where the lead gets added to the list. If they've opted into that list, then it does more than that. It's going to set the tag saying they've got access to this topic. So that's the basic status tag. They've access to this topic. That's more relevant if they've got access to a product or a membership site and so on. This is less meaningful in this particular case, but it's part of the standard practice. If someone opts into the list, they're normally getting access to something, so that tag gets set. And this is the point where I actually assign them to the list, or register, or subscribe them to the list. I do that within this automation. And this is where I set the tag which is going to subscribe them to the automation. So that's the tag that was used in this, not automation, the sequence up here. It's going to trigger that sequence. And this is the unsubscribe sequence. So if they click that unsubscribe event tag, if they click the unsubscribe tracking link, then this tag is going to be set by the tracking link here. My tracking link is going to set that tag saying they've clicked unsubscribe. This automation is going to be triggered, so that tag is set. Then what it does is it simply unsubscribes them from that sequence. That's it. Doesn't unsubscribe them from the list. They've unsubscribed from that particular sequence that I was sending, which is fine. That's what they asked to do. And I mean, in a sense, it saves a subscriber time. They could click on the main unsubscribe link and see all the other things they're subscribed to, because Kartra shows them a list of all the lists they're subscribed to and all the sequences they're subscribed to. And for most subscribers, that's going to be meaningless. They say, well, don't understand the difference between a lead, a list, and a sequence. Which should I unsubscribe from? And they may just unsubscribe from everything, which would be a shame, because it's only one thing they're not interested in. So this is actually a useful feature for the lead as well as for me to preserve my list. And finally, there's a little quirk in Kartra. If someone comes to the end of a list, then the list is complete, but they don't automatically get unsubscribed from a list. There's actually probably a good reason for that, but I haven't figured it out yet. Anyway, my approach is when they've reached the end of a list, I want to take them off that list. Sorry, that again. If they reach the end of a sequence, I would probably want to then unsubscribe them from that sequence. So that's just a little automation. If completes sequence, So that there's a condition that you can set in, you can check within automations, completed sequence. So if they complete that sequence, then unsubscribe them from that sequence. That's it. So actually I've given you quite the full detail of exactly how I go about it. So that I could have done this in many different ways. Someone could have completed the form, and within the, as I said, within the form, they would have automatically added them to the list. I could add an automation that said, if added to list, subscribe to sequence. And I wouldn't have needed the trigger tag in the sequence. All sorts of permutations. But I've decided on this approach, and now I can apply it consistently, really quickly, just by defining each, just a small number of variables, if you like, and a lot of which can then just come down from drop downs. So I hope that's useful, and somewhere at the end of this video or below or on the page, wherever you're watching it, there should be a link that you can click on, and that you will be able to subscribe to my list to get further posts, to get notified of further posts, either video posts or blog posts. So please do that, and you can stay up to date with new ideas and approaches, and I'll be describing my system in a bit more detail. Thanks very much for watching this video. I hope you found it helpful and interesting. If you did, I'd really appreciate it if you would click the like button below to show your appreciation, and also please do make a comment. Finally, please do click this circle right here to subscribe to my channel so you get notified of my future videos, and I look forward to seeing you in the next one.